They had gone to war believing they would never be captured. The men of the Africa Corps, sunburned, proud, hardened by sand and victory, had sworn that no British or American hand would ever take them alive. But by the spring of 1943, the Desert War was over. Rommel was gone. The last Axis stronghold in Tunisia had fallen, and as American Sherman tanks rolled through crumbling German lines, thousands of elite soldiers, once the pride of Hitler's army, laid down their weapons. They were marched to the coast in silence. Some carried medals. Some still clutched their Mausers as if they might use them again. But most were just exhausted. The heat, the dust, the hunger, it had stripped away the arrogance that filled their propaganda leaflets. Still, even in defeat, many expected a final act of defiance. They whispered that the Americans would shoot them, or that they'd be thrown into labor camps somewhere in the desert. Instead, they were herded onto ships, given cigarettes, and fed warm meals, more food than they'd seen in months. When the hatches closed, no one knew where they were going. Some thought they were bound for Britain. Others believed it was propaganda, that America wasn't real, that it was just another name in Allied lies. The voyage took weeks. They crossed the Atlantic in guarded convoys, surrounded by destroyers hunting U-boats. Inside the holds, prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with diesel and sweat. A few officers tried to maintain discipline, calling roll each morning, but most men just stared at the steel walls and wondered what awaited them on the other side. Then, one morning, the engines slowed. Voices echoed above deck. The doors opened, and sunlight poured in. The first thing they saw wasn't soldiers or barbed wire. It was cranes. As the ships docked, the Germans pressed against the rails, stunned into silence. Stretching out in every direction were endless rows of warehouses, trucks, locomotives, and ships. More machines than some had ever seen in their lives. New York Harbor, Norfolk, and Boston had become living proof of a world they had been told didn't exist. A corporal from the 10th Panzer Division later recalled, "We saw more ships in one harbor than Germany could build in a year." For men raised on the myth of German industrial superiority, it was like waking from a dream. They had been told that America was a land of chaos and corruption, rich but disorganized, ruled by weak men and greedy merchants. Yet everywhere they looked, the evidence said otherwise. Docks ran like clockwork. Cargo cranes lifted steel containers in perfect rhythm. Trains arrived on time, each one already loaded with supplies for another front. The entire system seemed alive, coordinated, tireless, endless. Even the air smelled different. Not of oil and smoke, but of gasoline and salt water. Clean power. Officers who had once memorized German production statistics began calculating in silence, realizing that their own factories could never match this scale. The U.S. was producing more in a single month than Germany could in a quarter. The truth was not shouted at them. It stood visible in every direction. When they were led off the ships, they walked past American soldiers with clean uniforms, new rifles, and steady eyes. No one shouted. No one struck them. One POW later said, "They looked at us like men who had already won, and didn't need to prove it." Buses and trains waited for them. On board, they were given sandwiches, fruit, and coffee. It was the first time in years many had tasted butter. Some wept quietly. Others refused to eat, convinced it was a trick. Propaganda had painted the Americans as barbarians who tortured captives. Instead, the guards joked, shared cigarettes, and even tried speaking broken German. One sergeant, when offered an apple, turned to his comrade and muttered, "If this is their cruelty, we have lost the right to call ourselves civilized." The journey inland revealed something even stranger: a nation untouched by war. As the trains rolled through the countryside, prisoners stared through barred windows at towns that looked like postcards. There were no bomb craters, no rubble, no burned-out cars. Children waved from train platforms, their hands full of candy and newspapers. Farmers plowed perfect fields. Factories stood tall and humming, their smokestacks a steady gray. Many POWs later confessed that they thought it was all staged. Some believed they were being shown fake towns, movie sets designed to break their morale. A lieutenant from the Africa Corps wrote years later, "We thought they were actors. No country could live like that while fighting a world war. But the illusion never broke. Every mile, every town, every bridge proved the same thing. This was real. The numbers confirmed what their eyes already knew." By mid-1943, more than 250,000 German prisoners had already been shipped to the United States. By war's end, that number would exceed 425,000, spread across more than 600 camps in 46 states. The largest concentrations were in Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, and Nebraska, far from the coasts, where escape was impossible. Each camp held anywhere from 2,000 to 6,000 men, guarded mostly by National Guard units and older U.S. soldiers. For those captured in Africa, the transition from battlefield to captivity felt almost surreal. 2 months earlier, they had fought and killed American troops under a burning sun. Now, they were being given blankets and medical checkups. The prisoners began to talk quietly among themselves, not about Hitler or the war, but about what they were seeing. They spoke of the cars, the highways, the food, the absence of fear. Some refused to believe it. To them, the sight of such abundance was not proof of strength, but decadence. They called it the illusion of comfort. Yet for many others, the experience planted a doubt they could never unlearn: that everything they had been told about America, about democracy, and even about themselves was wrong. When one transport stopped briefly in Chicago, prisoners were allowed to stretch their legs under guard. They looked up and saw buildings taller than church steeples, walls of glass and stone that reached into the clouds. One soldier whispered to another, "If this is what they build for offices, what do their factories look like?" No lecture could have taught them faster. The war they thought they understood, a contest of soldiers and tactics, was in truth a war of scale. America had more of everything: more oil, more food, more machines, more men. For the first time, they saw it not as rumor, but as fact. When the trains finally reached their destinations, the men were herded into new camps surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and floodlights. But even these fences felt strangely clean, almost precise. The posts were straight. The wire was polished. The food lines were orderly. The guards treated them by the book, handing out uniforms marked PW and issuing metal tags with serial numbers. The psychological impact was enormous. For soldiers raised in a system that preached German discipline as unmatched, it was disorienting to find an enemy who followed the rules better than they did. Some grew quiet, withdrawn. Others began asking questions about how such a nation had built so much, about why its soldiers didn't act like conquerors. They would soon learn that this first shock of scale, order, and mercy was only the beginning. America's true power wasn't just in its machines, it was in how it treated its captives, as men, not enemies. And that discovery would change far more than their understanding of war. The trains ran west for days. Inside the cars, the captured soldiers sat on wooden benches, staring through barred windows at a country they hadn't believed existed. When they'd left Europe, most of them expected to end up in some kind of prison island, a remote, miserable place where the enemy would starve them into obedience. Instead, what they saw outside looked like another planet. The first thing they noticed was how clean it was. The stations, the platforms, the fields beyond. Everything seemed untouched by war. There were no bomb craters, no burned houses, no refugees walking along the roads. Everywhere they looked, there was order. Towns were neat, the streets lined with cars and shop signs, church steeples unscarred. And when the train slowed, people came out to wave. Children waved flags. Women in summer dresses brought baskets of food to the guards. In some towns, factory workers on break just stood there, staring at the trains that carried the men who had once been called the world's best army. But they didn't throw stones or shout insults. They just looked curious, maybe even sympathetic. For the prisoners, the quiet dignity of it all was almost unnerving. One POW later remembered thinking, "They live as if the war is a rumor." Another said, "We thought America was chaos, but it looked like paradise." They had seen Britain under blackout, France in ruins, and North Africa starving. But here, even the fields seemed to shine. They passed farmhouses with tractors, barns painted red and white, cows fat and healthy. Children ran alongside the train waving with both hands. "It must be staged," one man muttered. "They are showing us fake towns." The disbelief ran deep. Nazi propaganda had drilled it into them for years that America was soft, a melting pot of criminals, Jews, and lazy workers who could never fight a real war. Yet here was a land not only fighting it, but thriving through it. Each mile stretched that lie thinner. When the train stopped for food or fuel, guards opened the doors, letting in air that smelled of grass and gasoline. They handed out sandwiches and milk in paper cartons. Many of the prisoners refused to eat at first. "They thought it was a trick," one guard later said. "Then they tasted the bread. Fresh, soft, and they couldn't stop." For the American soldiers, the Germans were just cargo, another logistical problem in a war of movement. But for the prisoners, every sight through the window was revelation. The sheer size of it, miles of open land, endless fields of wheat, rivers wide enough to swallow convoys whole. They passed steel mills, shipyards, and assembly plants so vast that their smokestacks seemed to rise into the sky. An engineer from Hamburg later wrote, "In one afternoon, I saw more machines than my city had built in a decade." Others remembered seeing rows of parked aircraft near Kansas and Oklahoma, training fields packed with bombers waiting for pilots. The Germans whispered to each other, "They build them faster than we can shoot them down." The scale was beyond anything the European mind could process. In Germany, towns were pressed close together, fields small and rationed. Here, the land itself was industrial. Every turn of the wheel brought another factory, another farm, another sign that America's power wasn't a matter of propaganda. It was geography and will. At night, the trains crossed plains under a sky so wide it seemed unreal. The prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, watching stars they didn't know had names. "It felt like we had left the earth," one soldier said years later in an interview with the Camp Hearn project. "We were captives, but the country looked free in every direction." The guards rarely spoke, except to check names or issue rations. But their silence carried no threat. They smoked, read newspapers, and treated their prisoners with a kind of professional boredom that the Germans found confusing. No one shouted. No one beat them. When one man collapsed from heat exhaustion, the guards stopped the train and carried him to the shade, giving him water from their canteens. The rest of the prisoners watched in disbelief. When they crossed the Mississippi, someone whispered, "Now we are in the heart of it." The train wound through Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, places the Germans could barely pronounce. For the first time, they realized how far they were from home. The war that had swallowed Europe was thousands of miles behind them now, and ahead of them was a nation that looked like it could build forever. At a small station in Kansas, local farmers stood by the tracks, hats in hand, watching the train pass. One woman, maybe 50 years old, waved and called out something in English, too faint to hear clearly. But her tone was kind. One of the prisoners raised his hand to wave back, then hesitated. It was the first time he had ever greeted an enemy. By the time they reached their destinations, the sprawling camps in Texas, Alabama, Nebraska, and beyond, the shock had settled into something heavier. Realization. They had seen with their own eyes what their generals never admitted, that Germany could never win against a country like this. A sergeant later put it bluntly, "The war was already lost when we saw their farms." They stepped off the trains into the heat, lined up under the American flag, and waited for orders. The camps stretched out before them, barbed wire, guard towers, barracks rows, all built with the precision of an army that never improvised. Yet even behind the wire, they couldn't forget what they had seen. One of them wrote in his diary that night, "They defeated us not with weapons, but with plenty." And though most wouldn't admit it aloud, they all knew the same thing. The enemy they'd been told to despise had built a world stronger than any ideology. The journey across America had turned their captivity into revelation. When the trains finally stopped, the men stepped into heat and silence. Long fences of barbed wire stretched in every direction, straight as compass lines. Behind them, rows of identical wooden barracks stood in the dust, each one numbered in black paint. A sign read simply, "Camp Hearn, U.S. Army." It didn't look like a prison. It looked like order. The guards spoke little. They were older men, National Guard or rear echelon troops, polite but firm. They counted heads, collected belts and knives, and handed out new clothes, khaki trousers stenciled with large black letters, PW, for prisoner of war. There were no insults, no beatings. When one German officer refused to give up his Iron Cross, the guard shrugged and said, "Keep it, it's yours." Inside, the barracks were clean. Wooden bunks lined both walls, each with a mattress, 2 blankets, and a pillow. Electric lights worked. There were showers, latrines, even recreation areas with soccer fields and libraries. In the dining hall, the prisoners were served hot meals 3 times a day: meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee. According to the Geneva Convention, POWs were entitled to the same rations as U.S. soldiers, and here that rule was followed exactly. The food alone stunned them. After years of rationing and hunger, the portions felt absurd. Some prisoners tried to save bread under their mattresses, thinking the generosity was temporary. When guards discovered it, they laughed, not to mock, but to reassure them that tomorrow's meal would come. Many of the new arrivals expected interrogation or propaganda lectures. Instead, they were handed work rosters. Under American law, prisoners could be assigned non-military labor as long as they were paid and treated humanely. Within weeks, thousands were working on farms, railroads, sawmills, and canneries. The arrangement was practical. The U.S. needed labor, and the prisoners needed purpose. One former soldier remembered his first day at a Texas cotton farm. "They gave us tools, not chains," he said. "We worked beside Americans. They paid us in coupons we could use in the camp store. I thought it was a mistake." Another, an engineer from Bremen, recalled helping repair tractors and being astonished by the machinery. Even their plows were better built than our tanks. Each camp had its own rhythm. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, prisoners organized orchestras, built theaters, and staged plays in German. Camp Swift in Texas had an art club, a barber shop, and a bakery that produced bread so good the guards often bought it. At Fort Robinson in Nebraska, POWs built model airplanes and studied English. The camps became small, self-contained worlds, fenced-in towns where soldiers who once fought across continents now lived on routine and reflection. The Americans treated order as a kind of morality. Everything was scheduled: meals, work, recreation, even quiet hours. Complaints were heard, medical needs met. The U.S. Army maintained strict records. Every prisoner was logged, photographed, and issued an identification tag. Letters were allowed, though censored. Packages from the Red Cross arrived regularly. Many prisoners wrote home in disbelief, describing the food, the freedom, the dignity. One letter, preserved in the Camp Hearn Oral History Project, reads, "Dear Mother, we are not in hell, but somewhere very far from it. The Americans keep their word. We work, we eat, we live." For the guards, most of whom had never been to Europe, the Germans were just men in uniforms, no different from anyone else. Many became curious about them. Some guards brought books, dictionaries, or newspapers to share. When Christmas came, local church groups sent gifts and baked goods to the camps. In Aliceville, children sent cards decorated with drawings of peace doves. The prisoners responded by building a nativity scene out of scrap wood and painting it with leftover barn paint. The moral contrast with German and Soviet camps could not have been sharper. In the East, German POWs froze to death in open fields. In the West, American prisoners worked to exhaustion in mines and factories. Here, in the United States, the enemy was treated according to law. The effect was profound. The same men who once believed in their own racial and cultural superiority now found themselves shown mercy by the people they had been told were inferior. Daily life grew strangely normal. The prisoners read American newspapers, censored but still informative, and listened to music over loudspeakers. Baseball games were allowed, and soon many Germans were playing alongside their guards. At Camp Hearn, POWs planted gardens and held art exhibitions. Some even volunteered to help build additional barracks. The U.S. Army engineers who oversaw the projects wrote in reports that German workmanship was precise, almost enthusiastic. The war felt far away. The fences, though tall, didn't radiate fear. The guards joked that no one would bother escaping anyway. The nearest town was 50 miles away, and there was nowhere to hide. Still, a few tried. Most didn't get far, and those who were caught were returned without harm. One guard at Camp Swift recalled, "They escaped just to see the countryside." Inside the wire, divisions remained. Hardline Nazis still held influence in some camps, running secret courts and punishing anyone they saw as weak. But as months passed, those ideologues lost their grip. The reality outside the wire, the abundance, the calm, the respect, chipped away at everything they'd believed about the enemy. The American officers noticed it too. Reports from 1944 show a marked drop in disciplinary issues and ideological propaganda inside the camps. One commander wrote, The average German POW now appears more interested in American life than in German victory. There were moments of quiet humanity that none of them forgot. When a tornado hit parts of Texas in 1944, POWs volunteered to help rebuild a nearby town. Civilians who once feared them began to treat them as neighbors. Some invited them to church. Others traded them cigarettes and apples. One woman in Nebraska, whose husband was fighting in Europe, wrote in her diary, "They are polite, grateful, and look so young. They could be ours." By the end of 1944, many prisoners had lived nearly 2 years in America. They had seen the efficiency of its systems, the fairness of its laws, and the kindness of its people. For some, it caused deep confusion. For others, quiet admiration. One man, interviewed decades later, said, "We came as enemies. We left as witnesses. In the evenings, when the lights dimmed and the camps grew quiet, the prisoners talked in low voices about what they had seen beyond the fences, the vastness, the order, the calm." For men who had believed Germany was destined to rule the modern world, that sight was harder to escape than the barbed wire itself. They would remember it long after the war ended, the country that treated them not as conquerors or villains, but as men. They thought they understood industry. They came from a nation that worshipped precision, where machines were built like art, and factories were symbols of order and strength. Germany had prided itself on discipline, on engineering, on its belief that no one could match its ability to produce. But what the captured soldiers saw inside American industry shattered that idea completely. By 1944, tens of thousands of German prisoners had been moved from the southern base camps to labor detachments scattered across the United States. They worked in lumber yards in Wisconsin, in canneries in Oregon, in steel foundries in Pennsylvania, and on farms from Texas to Iowa. Under the Geneva Convention, they could not be forced to make weapons, but they could work in industries related to food, construction, and raw materials. To the Americans, it was practical. There was a labor shortage, and the war machine demanded manpower. To the Germans, it became an education. The first shock came from the machines themselves. Even in small local plants, equipment was modern, abundant, and efficient. Conveyor belts moved without pause, cranes lifted tons of steel in minutes, and trucks lined up in perfect rhythm. Many prisoners of war were trained mechanics or engineers back home. They knew how things were built, how long each process should take. But what they saw in America defied their calculations. At a Texas lumber mill, one German foreman stood watching a mechanized saw line for half an hour before saying quietly to the guard, "We would have needed 30 men to do this." Another, assigned to a cannery in California, later told an interviewer, "They built machines to replace the effort of people." That was their secret. We built men to replace the failure of machines. The more they worked, the clearer the picture became. The United States wasn't just bigger. It was organized for production in a way Germany had never imagined. It had resources untouched by war, railways that ran without disruption, and factories that operated around the clock. And unlike Germany, where strategic bombing crippled cities, American cities remained fully functional. Power, water, and transport never stopped. Reports from the U.S. Army Service Forces, 1944, confirm that over 200,000 POWs were employed in war-related industries, cutting timber, building warehouses, harvesting crops, maintaining railroads, and canning rations. They were paid modest wages, part of which went into camp funds, and the rest could be spent at commissaries stocked with cigarettes, soap, and stationery. But what struck them wasn't the money. It was the method. Factories didn't operate on fear. Supervisors didn't shout. Schedules weren't built around punishment. Instead, everything ran on systems. Measurable, predictable, scalable. One German engineer recalled in his post-war memoir, "Their strength was not genius. It was repetition. They made things simple enough to make millions of them." That realization hit hardest when they began comparing numbers. In 1944, the U.S. produced 49,000 tanks compared to Germany's 19,000. In aircraft, the difference was even more staggering. 96,000 American planes against 39,000 German. While German cities were being flattened by bombing raids, Detroit alone built more war vehicles in a year than the entire German armaments industry could supply. Some of the POWs were assigned to work near aircraft factories or shipyards and caught glimpses of assembly lines that stretched for blocks. The Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan, run by Ford, was often mentioned among prisoners. The factory could produce one complete B-24 bomber every hour. A German pilot captured in 1944 later told an interviewer, "When I heard of that place, I understood. No pilot, no strategy, no courage could fight against that." The Industrial Revolution broke the myth of German superiority that had been drilled into them for years. They had been told that Germans were masters of machines and Americans were clumsy amateurs, men who had to buy success. But here, in the heart of their captivity, they saw the truth. American strength came from coordination, from scale, from trust. Even the smallest details impressed them. Trucks that started instantly in cold weather, fuel pumps that never jammed, canned food that stayed fresh for months. When one POW mechanic disassembled a worn-out tractor to repair it, he found each part numbered and replaceable, a design built for mass production, not prestige. "We built things to last forever," he said later. "They built things to last long enough, and then build them again." The guards, who often worked alongside them, rarely explained the philosophy behind it. They didn't need to. The lesson was visible everywhere. Each machine was a statement. Time mattered more than perfection, and quantity could become a form of quality. At first, some of the German officers mocked it. They called it factory warfare, soulless and mechanical. But as the war dragged on, as news of German defeats filtered through newspapers and Red Cross bulletins, that arrogance dissolved. They began to see that the same efficiency that made a truck or plane could rebuild a country, or feed one. U.S. War Department records from 1945 include testimonies from POWs who openly admitted that their view of the war had changed. One read, "We lost before we began. They had more factories, more fuel, more people. They made war like they made bread, by the millions. It wasn't just the machines, it was the attitude." Workers smiled. Foremen thanked them for a job well done. When production quotas were met, Americans celebrated, not punished. It was a culture built around momentum, something the Germans, trained to obey, had never experienced. A U.S. intelligence report on prisoner morale from 1945 noted a marked shift from ideological resistance to curiosity and admiration. The more they worked, the more many of them began to question what they had fought for. At Camp Aliceville, guards noticed that the hardest laborers were often the ones who had once been the most loyal Nazis. One of them explained it later. "We had to prove to ourselves that we still had value. But in America, value meant work, not rank." When engineers among the prisoners were occasionally allowed to tour or assist in civilian facilities, they returned silent. They spoke in low voices about conveyor belts, turbines, and assembly systems that could never have existed in bombed-out Germany. One said, "It wasn't war that beat us. It was organization." In that realization lay something deeper than defeat. It was a quiet respect. They had entered captivity believing the enemy was crude and wasteful. They now understood that behind the kindness and calm was a system so vast it could outproduce an empire. Years later, when asked what moment convinced him Germany would lose, one former Africa Corps lieutenant said, "Not El Alamein, not Stalingrad. The first time I worked in an American plant." By the end of 1944, that lesson had spread through nearly every camp in the United States. The soldiers who had once cheered Hitler's boasts of invincibility now saw those words for what they were: noise against the hum of a factory that never stopped. And as they watched American workers go home each evening, to cars, families, and warm houses untouched by war, they realized that the true power of their captors wasn't their weapons, but the way they built their world. It began with confusion. For men who had marched under the swastika, who had been told they were the chosen elite of a superior nation, captivity in America was supposed to be humiliation. But what they experienced instead was dignity. They were given food, work, safety, and respect, not fear. And slowly, that contradiction began to erode everything they thought they knew about the world. At first, the prisoners whispered among themselves. In the early months, there were still diehards, men who painted swastikas on barrack walls, held secret meetings, and swore vengeance. They called the others weak for enjoying the comfort of the enemy. Some camps even saw small Nazi cells that punished those who spoke too freely or fraternized with guards. But as the months turned into years, something larger than ideology began to take hold. It was ordinary kindness: farmers who thanked them for a good day's work, guards who brought them cigarettes or books, American families who smiled as they passed the camp fence. These gestures didn't feel like propaganda. They felt human. One former soldier wrote in his diary, "We were treated as men, not monsters. It confused us more than hatred ever could." The U.S. War Department had a term for it: re-education, through example. There were no lectures about democracy, no sermons on freedom. The lesson was simpler: let them see it. The Special Projects Division, a secret branch of the Army, oversaw cultural programs inside the camps. POWs attended film screenings, debates, and reading circles. They watched newsreels showing liberated French towns, industrial progress, and even American elections. They were encouraged to read translated versions of the U.S. Constitution and newspapers like Stars and Stripes. Some resisted. Others couldn't stop reading. By 1945, many camps had established education huts staffed by professors, many of them German émigrés who had fled the Nazis years earlier. They taught history, economics, and philosophy, carefully curated to show that freedom wasn't chaos, that equality wasn't weakness. One POW recalled, "We had never seen democracy. We had only been told it was disorder. But in America, even their guards had opinions. For men raised in a system where obedience was worshipped, that freedom of thought was shocking. They had been trained to equate power with control. Here, they saw power exercised through trust. The Americans didn't need to scream or threaten. Their authority came from calm confidence, from the idea that rules were respected because they were fair, not because they were feared." In time, curiosity replaced defiance. When the Red Cross delivered international mail, many prisoners began corresponding with American families who volunteered as pen pals. They exchanged letters about farming, religion, and literature. A few learned English by reading local newspapers and listening to radio broadcasts. Guards even reported that some prisoners of war had begun following baseball scores. The turning point came when news of Germany's defeat reached the camps in May 1945. The reaction was not what many expected. There was grief, yes, but also relief. "It's over," one prisoner said, laying his cap on the ground. "Now, maybe we can begin to live again." The collapse of the Reich forced them to confront the truth. The propaganda that had fed their pride was gone. The empire that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. What remained were questions, and the strange, undeniable memory of kindness from the very people they had been told were enemies of civilization. In those final months of captivity, something profound began to happen. Men who had once believed in absolute authority started to debate ideas. They discussed justice, democracy, guilt. At Camp Herne, POWs formed a Free Germany Committee, openly rejecting Hitler's ideology. In Camp Aliceville, prisoners staged plays mocking Nazi officers and censorship. The same men who once shouted "Heil Hitler" now laughed at his speeches played over confiscated radios. The American officers noticed it. Reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General, 1945, documented a visible shift in morale and worldview. One officer wrote, "They arrived as soldiers of the Reich. They leave as men who understand freedom by witnessing it." Even small interactions carried weight. When a POW injured his hand in a sawmill, the guard rushed him to a local hospital where American nurses treated him with care. "I couldn't believe it," he said later. "They bandaged the hand that had carried a rifle against them." Moments like that spread quietly through the camps. They didn't erase guilt or undo crimes, but they planted doubt, the most dangerous thing to any ideology built on lies. A few of the prisoners who had shown intellectual promise were invited to assist in camp administration, translation, and education efforts. Some became de facto mediators, explaining American customs to fellow POWs. In private, they admitted that what they had seen had changed them forever. "The Americans did not defeat us with hate," one said. "They defeated us with decency." When Germany surrendered, many feared they would now face revenge. Instead, the treatment stayed the same. Food rations were reduced as shortages spread, but no cruelty followed. They were still allowed mail, still paid for labor, still treated under Geneva law. It was mercy that felt almost unbearable. The most lasting transformation wasn't written in reports, it was internal. Thousands of men who once believed democracy was weakness now saw that it was strength. They had seen it survive war, produce abundance, and maintain humanity under strain. Years later, historians would call it America's quiet victory. The re-education not through force, but through example. Many of those prisoners would go on to play roles in rebuilding West Germany. Some became teachers, writers, and businessmen. Others entered politics, carrying with them the lessons they learned behind barbed wire. One of them, Reinhard Mohn, a former Luftwaffe officer held in Kansas, later became the head of Bertelsmann, one of Europe's largest publishing empires. He credited his democratic beliefs to the fairness he experienced as a prisoner. Another, Franz Krapf, who worked on a Texas farm as a POW, later served as West Germany's ambassador to Japan and NATO. Both men said the same thing in interviews decades later. "In captivity, we learned freedom." By the time the last POWs were repatriated in 1946 and 1947, they carried home not just memories of America's power, but an understanding of its ideals. They returned to cities in ruins, to hunger and despair, but also to a vision of what a free and organized nation could look like. One wrote on the ship home, "In their captivity, we saw humanity. In our freedom, we will try to remember it." And that became the quiet legacy of the German prisoners of war in America, men who came as symbols of a brutal regime, but left as witnesses to its opposite. Not because someone told them what to believe, but because they had seen it with their own eyes. The war was over, but the journey home felt like stepping into another planet. Between 1946 and 1947, the United States began the mass repatriation of its German prisoners of war. More than 370,000 men boarded trains, then ships, carrying with them their last wages, Red Cross parcels, and small gifts from the Americans who had guarded them. Many didn't want to leave. For years, they had lived in a world of order, food, and quiet, a world that functioned. They didn't yet know what waited on the other side of the Atlantic. The ships took them east, through ports like Norfolk, New York, and New Orleans, bound for Le Havre or Bremerhaven. The journey took weeks. The mood was strange, subdued, uncertain. There was no celebration, no music, only the heavy silence of men who knew they were going home to something that no longer existed. When the coast of Europe finally appeared, it wasn't the homeland they remembered. It was a continent still bleeding. The docks were skeletons of steel. Cities that had once stood proud, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Munich, were flattened plains of brick and ash. Trains moved slowly through bombed-out stations, windows blown out, smoke seeping through every gap. When the prisoners disembarked, they were not met by cheering crowds or family reunions. They stepped into chaos. Germany in 1946 was a wasteland. Food was rationed to barely 1,000 calories a day in some regions. Winter came early, and fuel was scarce. People burned furniture for warmth. Children scavenged the ruins for coal. The black market replaced the economy. Cigarettes became currency. For many of the returning soldiers, the shock was unbearable. They had left a country that believed itself invincible. They returned to find it starved, occupied, and divided. Those who had spent years in America could not hide their disbelief. They had seen abundance, clean towns, working trains, shelves full of bread. Now they saw their own country reduced to rubble and hunger. Some wrote that they felt like strangers in their homeland. One former prisoner, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who would later become Germany's foreign minister, recalled in a 1980 interview, "When I returned, I found ruins not only of stone, but of spirit. The transition was not just physical, it was moral. They had come from camps where guards treated them with respect, where the rule of law held. Now they returned to a nation struggling with guilt, denial, and defeat. The Nazi symbols were gone, but the silence around them was heavy. Many of the returning men didn't know how to speak about what they'd seen, about the mercy of the enemy. Some were met with resentment. Families who had suffered under bombing or lost loved ones at the front saw them as lucky. Others simply couldn't believe their stories." A former POW from Camp Swift told the Camp Hearn Oral History Project, "When I said we had hot meals, libraries, concerts, they called me a liar. They said I had been brainwashed. They didn't understand that the enemy could have shown us more humanity than our own leaders ever did." Still, something had changed in them. Many carried the lessons of America quietly, almost privately. They had seen how a society could function without fear, how authority could coexist with freedom. They began to rebuild with that image in mind. In the American zone of occupation, some of these former POWs became teachers, mayors, engineers. They joined reconstruction projects, administrative offices, and later political parties that shaped what became the Federal Republic of Germany. One of them, Reinhard Mohn, who had been held in a Kansas camp, returned to find his family company, Bertelsmann, in ruins. He rebuilt it from scratch, applying the organizational principles he had seen in the U.S. industrial system. Decades later, Bertelsmann became one of Europe's largest publishing and media corporations. Mohn credited his philosophy of responsibility and partnership to what he observed in American workplaces and camps. Another, Franz Krapf, a former Luftwaffe officer, came back to a shattered homeland and entered the newly forming Foreign Service. His diplomatic career, representing West Germany and Japan, then NATO, was guided by what he called the lesson of captivity, that power earns respect only when it acts with restraint. The repatriation process itself became one of the most successful mass returns in modern history. The U.S. War Department worked with the International Red Cross and British and French authorities to ensure humane treatment even as the camps closed. Each prisoner was medically examined, debriefed, and given rations for the journey. Many were issued papers that stated, "Released prisoner of war, treated under the Geneva Convention." For men who had lived through both the front and captivity, that line mattered more than medals. But the emotional adjustment was harder. They returned to families who no longer recognized them, to streets that no longer existed. One prisoner wrote home from Bremerhaven, "I left a soldier. I came back a ghost." Some found work rebuilding railways or clearing debris in ruined cities. Others drifted between temporary shelters. The American food parcels sent through the Marshall Plan years later brought another wave of shock. Boxes labeled USA, filled with flour, milk powder, and tinned meat. For the former POWs, it was the final reminder of the nation that had once held them captive but now fed their children. The contrast between what they saw in the United States and what they returned to became a driving force behind West Germany's moral and industrial rebirth. The generation that had been prisoners of war brought with them an understanding of efficiency, democracy, and accountability that reshaped local governance. Historians later noted that the economic miracle of the 1950s, the Wirtschaftswunder, owed much to the quiet pragmatism of men who had learned discipline not from ideology, but from example. Still, not all adjusted. Some carried guilt for surviving captivity while comrades perished. Others struggled to reconcile their identity, veterans of a defeated army, witnesses to a system that collapsed. A few returned to East Germany, where Soviet authorities treated them as potential traitors and often imprisoned them again. But those who remained in the West became the bridge between two worlds, the Germany that had fallen and the one that would rise. Years later, during the Cold War, many of those former POWs became advocates for U.S.-German friendship. Veterans groups organized reunions with their former American guards and hosts. In 1976, a group of ex-prisoners from Camp Hearn returned to Texas to visit the site. They found only a few concrete foundations left, overgrown with grass. Standing there, one man said quietly to a reporter, "We learned what victory looks like, and it wasn't ours." The story of those prisoners, of the men who came as conquerors and left as students of freedom, remains one of the least told yet most revealing chapters of the war. Their journey ended not with vengeance or propaganda, but with perspective. In captivity, they had seen a world that worked. When they came home to ruins, they carried that vision like a seed, and from it, something new grew. Not the empire they once fought for, but a democracy strong enough to last. In the years that followed, the story of the German prisoners of war in America faded quietly into history, but its impact never disappeared. What began as an act of necessity became one of the most remarkable moral victories of the 20th century, a demonstration that strength, when guided by decency, can change even those who came to destroy it. By 1947, the last German POWs had left American soil. Many never stopped thinking about it. Letters continued to arrive from Europe, written in careful English, sent to the towns and farms where they had once worked. Some addressed their former guards by name, thanking them for kindness. Others simply wrote, "I hope you are well." I remember. For the Americans who had known them, the feeling was mutual. Communities across the South and Midwest spoke of the prisoners with surprising affection. Farmers who had relied on their labor during the war described them as hardworking and polite. Children remembered them teaching songs, fixing fences, carving toys. In many small towns, locals petitioned to keep their workers longer, even after Germany's surrender. The U.S. government, which had expected resentment from citizens forced to host enemy soldiers, instead found the opposite. Reports from the War Department's Prisoner of War Division, 1946, noted that relations between POWs and American civilians have been characterized by goodwill, mutual respect, and discipline. It was an outcome no one had predicted. But the deeper transformation happened on the other side of the ocean. In post-war Germany, former POWs who had seen America firsthand became quiet ambassadors for a new idea: that democracy, though fragile, was stronger than tyranny. Many took positions in government, education, and business. They helped draft policies, build industries, and guide their communities away from extremism. Reinhard Mohn, who rebuilt Bertelsmann into a global company, credited his experience in Kansas for shaping his belief in responsibility through freedom. Franz Krapf, who had labored on a Texas farm, later negotiated for West Germany in NATO councils, convinced that real power begins with fairness. Thousands of others carried smaller but no less lasting lessons: that order without cruelty was possible, that authority could exist without fear. Historians now see those men as part of Germany's moral reconstruction. The U.S. War Department's re-education program, once dismissed as idealistic, proved quietly effective. Without sermons or coercion, it planted ideas that took root when the ruins cleared. The men who had seen the best of their enemy became the architects of a democratic Germany. American treatment of POWs also set an international precedent. The United States had held over 425,000 German prisoners across 700 camps, spread from California to Maine, and despite isolated incidents, the record remained overwhelmingly humane. Geneva Convention standards were not only met, they were often exceeded. The Red Cross confirmed that nearly all German POWs in the U.S. survived captivity, well-fed, well-housed, and medically treated. In contrast, less than half of the Germans captured on the Eastern Front ever came home. It became a quiet point of pride for the American military, proof that even at the height of global war, decency could be maintained. As one U.S. general later wrote, "We defeated Nazism without becoming it." Over time, the memory of that decency reshaped international relations. When West Germany joined NATO in 1955, many of its new officers and diplomats had once been POWs in the U.S. They understood American discipline not as dominance, but as partnership. Their shared experience of structure, fairness, and respect became the foundation for an alliance that endures to this day. Some stories reached deeper into the personal. At the Camp Aliceville Museum in Alabama, letters are still displayed between former prisoners and local families. One, written in 1948, reads, "You showed us that strength is not cruelty. You built fences around us, yes, but you also opened a door in our minds." That sentiment echoed across decades. During the 1970s and 80s, reunions were held in Texas, Alabama, and Nebraska. Former prisoners stood on the same ground where they had once worked under guard. They brought their children and grandchildren to show them the places where, paradoxically, they had first experienced freedom. A former Africa Corps sergeant told an American journalist during one such reunion, "It was behind barbed wire that I stopped believing in war." Another said, "They fed us, they treated us fairly, and that fairness changed everything. You cannot hate a man who treats you like a human being." The legacy went beyond memory. It became measurable. In surveys conducted by the German Institute for Contemporary History in the 1980s, former POWs who had been held in the U.S. consistently reported more positive attitudes toward democracy and reconciliation than those who had been held elsewhere. Nearly 70% described their captivity as decisive in shaping their post-war values. And for the United States, it became an enduring symbol of moral power. The idea that true victory lies not only in battle, but in how one treats the defeated. It stood in stark contrast to the images of concentration camps that emerged from Europe, and it gave the post-war world a blueprint for humane conduct, even in the aftermath of destruction. By the time the last survivors passed away, their memories had become stories passed to grandchildren, about the trains that rolled through green fields instead of ruins, about the Americans who smiled instead of shouted, about the lesson that the mightiest weapon of all was compassion. In the end, the German prisoners, who once arrived proud, defiant, and certain of their empire's destiny, left America carrying something their leaders could never give them: humility and hope. The war had begun with the belief that power came from domination. It ended with the proof that power endures longest when it chooses mercy. That was the final revelation of the German prisoners of war in America. A lesson not written in treaties or speeches, but in every meal shared, every fair word spoken, and every life spared. Because sometimes the greatest victory comes not from how you win a war, but from how you treat those who lost it.